These blessings we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. It's good to see everybody this morning. We've got a couple of visitors I don't recognize. I'd like to welcome you all. For those of you joining us on live stream, especially if you're joining us for the first time today, you are honored guests. And we'd like to remind you that if you want to participate in our worship service, which begins at 11 o'clock, you need to log off the site you're on now and log back onto the same site to participate in that worship service. And I see an old friend walking in now late. Haven't seen her in a while, but one of my favorite people in all the world. So let's begin our class. And I always start anymore. Where were we last week? And we're in an exciting place. Paul had been rescued by the Roman army twice now from riotous Jews that wanted to kill him. He'd been down to talk to the Sanhedrin to make a defense against them, and they turned into a riotous group. And the commander of the Roman soldiers said, you go down in the middle of that group and you take Paul away from them by force. And that's what they did. And they took Paul back up to the Tower of Antonio, which was the Roman garrison location at that time. And that night, Paul must have been depressed at what was going on. He knew he was going to get turned over to the Gentiles, and that's exactly what happened. Been prophesied by Agabus. So there he was at night, probably feeling pretty down about the whole situation. And the Lord appeared to him in the night and said, Paul, you be of good cheer. Because just as you have testified for me here in Jerusalem, you're going to have to testify for me in Rome also. So Paul knew that whatever happened in the next day or so, he was going to Rome, as he had anticipated and wanted to do for some time past. But at that time, a group of about 40 Jews decided they wanted to kill Paul, and so they joined in a conspiracy together, more than 40 the scriptures say, and they were going to kill Paul the next day. And they went down and they talked to the high priest and some of the elders of the Sanhedrin, leaders of the Jewish people and people that ran the temple, and they confided in them what they wanted to do, and they asked them to join that conspiracy. So you send up to Lysias, the commander, and tell him that you want to question Paul further, and when he's on his way down, we will murder him before he gets here. And so we had the head of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the chief priest, and some of the elders of that group had joined in this conspiracy to murder Paul without a valid trial. And so that's where it stood. And that's where we are today. And I'm going to pick up in verse 15. I'm in Acts 23, verse 15. And I'm going to pick back in verse 15. It said, now therefore you and the council notify the commander to bring him Paul down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation, and we for our part are ready to slay him before he comes near the place. I'm going to stop right there. We're just getting started, and I'm going to read some more. You know I like to do that. But I'm mindful of verse here, and I'm mindful of a subject called the providence of God, and the fact that Jesus said, I will never leave you or forsake you. But there is a passage in Romans 8, verse 28 that I dearly love. You're all familiar with it. And we all know that God causes all things to come together for good to those who love him and are called according to his promise. What a wonderful promise to us. And that promise was to Paul also. So God in his providence was going to cause all good things to happen to Paul, just like he causes all good things to happen to us when we're called in accordance with his purpose and when we love him. Well, Paul had shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that he loved the Lord and that he loved God. And so here he was, Jesus had said, Paul, you be of good cheer, you're going to Rome. And here these 40 guys, more than 40 guys, had whipped up this conspiracy to murder Paul. And gone down to the leader of the Sanhedrin, the chief priest of the Jews, and got them to participate, and they were going to send a note to Lycia, send Paul back down here so we can investigate him further. And that was where we stood in that passage. But now let's take a look at the providence of God. And this is one of my favorite passages in Scripture. And I'm in verse 16. But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. And he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." And the commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire something more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in vain for him, or to wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse, not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." Paul's nephew, the son of his sister, found out about this conspiracy. And it was a young man. We had that phrase used about Paul when Paul was holding the clothes of those who were murdering Stephen some years before, a generation earlier. Generally, it's thought that when that phrase is used, a young man in Scripture, you're talking about someone 16 to 40 years old. So here we have a young fellow who is obviously Paul's nephew, the sister of his son, or the son of his sister, who found out about this conspiracy. Well, the Scriptures are absolutely silent on any further information about this young man. Was he a believer? He was obviously a Jew. He's obviously in Jerusalem. Was he doing the same thing that Paul had done a generation before, studying at the feet of noted religious teachers in the temple in Jerusalem? We don't know those answers. But he was a young man, and he screwed up his courage, and when he found about this conspiracy and how he found out about it, we know, but with 40 people making this plan and spreading it around, it's obvious that that news was going to get around, and somehow or another, this young man heard about it and understood the implications. Enough of the details that he felt like he had to take action. And the action he took was, he went to see his uncle. He went to see the Apostle Paul, who was in custody in Herod's Praetorium there in Jerusalem. That took a lot of courage just to do that. In fact, if the people that were involved in this conspiracy had known who he was and his relationship to Paul and saw him going up to the Tower of Antonio, they might have killed him first to keep him from spreading the word or to telling anyone. So he found his way up, and somehow or another, the Roman soldiers let him in, which says something in itself. How did he get in that occupied place where Paul was being held prisoner to talk to Paul? But he did, and all this is at the providence of God. None of this would have happened if God wasn't behind it. We know that. But here he is, and he made his way to Paul, and he told Paul what was going on. And instead of Paul telling a centurion that was close by, and there was a Roman officer close by, he had his nephew directed directly to the commander. He wanted this information to go directly to the commander of the Roman forces in Jerusalem. And he said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something that he needs to say to him." And the centurion trusted Paul enough that he followed Paul's suggestion, which is interesting. When you have a prisoner, a lot of times you don't follow their instructions. You don't do what they ask you to do. But here we have another example where Roman authorities are doing what Paul said. Yeah, Steve?
That young man apparently was a Roman citizen, or he would have never been able to do these things. He had to be a citizen to be able to approach the Roman garrison. His uncle was a citizen, so therefore he probably was, because it was a promise to Paul and his family when they went to Tarsus, when they did the city. So the child had to be a Roman citizen to be able to accomplish these things.
Steve, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you again today. I think you're talking about the fact that he was Paul's relative, and that perhaps that had something to do with the fact that he was allowed in, and I suspect that's true. And I don't know if I could...
John, he had to be a Roman citizen to be able to do these things.
Well, somebody help me out, Mike.
He had to be a Roman citizen. He had to be a Roman citizen.
Well, he was a Roman citizen. We know that for a fact. Paul was, so his nephew had to be too. Did they know that? He may have said that. That's a good point. He may have told them, I'm a Roman citizen. And they knew at that point that Paul was a Roman citizen. So that, and in fact, that is a very good point. That's probably the reason that he got into the citadel, and probably the reason that they were treating Paul with such dignity. Because Roman citizens under that law at that time, under Roman law, were treated well compared to other folks in the land. In any event, whatever the case, this young man was directed to the commander of the garrison, and he took him by the hand and led him aside to talk to him privately to see what he had to say. I thought that in itself said something about the commander. The commander had enough intelligence to know that this young man didn't just walk in here for nothing. And Paul didn't direct him over here to talk to me when he's in a situation unless he had something important to say. And he wanted to keep it private. So he led him aside and said, in private, what is it you would like to tell me? And of course the young man told him about the conspiracy. And so here we are. The commander of the Roman garrison had just found out that there was a conspiracy of more than 40 men lying in wait for the next day to murder Paul. And the commander knew that we're talking about a Roman citizen. Good point, Stephen. So what was this man going to do? And I think this man was a man of decision. He was decisive. He didn't get to be commander of 1,000 Roman soldiers without being able to make a decision. And probably make it pretty quickly. So I'm going to pick up again in verse 23. In 22, so the commander let the young man go, instructing him, tell no one that you have notified me of these things. So he didn't want that news to get around, so he let Paul's nephew go and said, you don't tell anybody what you just told me, because he didn't want that word to get back to conspirators, and he didn't want that word to get back to the Sanhedrin, because he was fixing to take decisive action, and he didn't want those folks to get in the middle of it. So let's read a little bit further here. I'm in verse 23. And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were also to provide mounts and put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix, the governor, and he wrote him a letter having this form. Let me stop one more time here. We're talking about nearly 500 troops, not counting the 70 or 80 or 90 horses and donkeys that were going along in it. We're talking about a big crowd, and they were ordered, you get ready by 9 o'clock tonight, and you're going to take Paul down to Caesarea. It's going to be done in the middle of the night. It's going to be done in secret as much as they could. But when you think about 40 men that were laying in wait to assassinate Paul, now they were outnumbered 10 to 1. commander wasn't gonna take any chances that those guys with their numbers could interfere with his plan, and his plan was to preserve the life of Paul, who was a Roman citizen. You get this all ready, by 9 o'clock at night, you're gonna head out of here towards Caesarea, and you're gonna have enough animals to transport Paul. When he said animals there, well, Paul had other people there around him, perhaps even associated with him while he was in the Praetorium, such as Luke, such as Titus, such as the 9 or 10 folks that came from the various congregations to help distribute that gift that they had brought to Jerusalem. Plus, he may have had personal friends in Jerusalem from times past, and I'm sure he did, members of the church. In any event, we don't know how many animals that were set there along with Paul, but it could have been enough for a sizable party. And we know there are at least 70 horsemen in this group, so there are almost 500 Roman soldiers that were taking Paul down to Caesarea. Now, Caesarea was about 65 miles away from Rome. 65 miles. And so they had a good ways to go in this caravan before they had Paul in the safety that they tried. And they were sending him down to the governor, the Roman governor of Judea, in this process. So Lysias decided, I can't just send him down here without any information from the governor as to why I'm sending him. So he sat down and wrote the governor a letter, and that's where we are. We're going to read that letter. And it's quite an interesting document in itself. But it tells you a little bit more about this commander. Not only was he in command of 1,000 Roman soldiers there in Jerusalem, he was educated. He could write. And so here we are. I'm in verse 26. And now we find out the name of this gentleman. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix. Greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came upon them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for what they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. Remember that fact. There wasn't a single accusation that Lysias could say warranted death or imprisonment. So, when I was informed that there would be a plot against a man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered a letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. A short passage, interesting letter, very tactful and political. Most excellent governor Felix. We're introduced to Felix here, and Felix is being dressed in what you would address any high-ranking government official in those days, most excellent government. And so Claudius used this kind of terminology to address the governor, as well he should. The governor was his boss, had life and death authority over Claudius Lysias. What a name, Claudius Lysias. Claudius was the emperor of Rome. Did he take that name just to show that he was respectful of Claudius? Who knows? But that happened in those days. But anyway, he comes down to us in history as Claudius Lysias. And so he writes this letter to Felix, the governor. Now, who was this guy Felix? Felix had been the governor of Judea from about 52 AD to about 60 BC, or not 80, I'm back in the right century, I guess. from about 52 AD to 60 AD. So he was the governor of Judea for about 7 years. But he had been in that administration, he had been the governor of Samaria before that. So he had a history in Palestine among the Jews. And he had evidently been in power in Jerusalem when this took place about 7 years. And so he was there in Caesarea. And that's where the governor of Judea, the Roman governor of Judea, spent his time. That place had been built by Herod the Great about 25, 30 years before the birth of Christ. And he'd built a number of large palaces down there in this created seaport. And what he had done on the basis of an old antique lighthouse that was no longer there, the Tower of Strabos, he built a new seaport in that area about 65 miles away from Jerusalem and just lavished these wondrous palaces around it. And archaeologists today have discovered some of those foundations and realized how big they were and how glorious that place must have been. But that was the home of the Roman government. That's where Pontius Pilate lived. So when they were in Jerusalem, that was not where they lived, and that's not where they spent most of their time. They had about 3,000 Roman soldiers stationed in Caesarea as their base of power in that land, the land that was not necessarily safe for Romans or anybody else. But this man Felix had been governor for a while, and we know quite a bit about Felix from people who wrote about him in them days, from Tacitus, the Senate historian, Roman historian. We know that he was a slave, but he was the brother of a man named Pallas, who was a friend of Claudius and Nero. And this man who was a slave became governor of Judea. But Tacitus, when he wrote about Felix, he said this man was brutal and cruel. He ruled with the power of a king, but with the mind of a slave. Well, we're reading about Felix here, and he doesn't seem like he's that rough and tough a guy, but when Josephus was writing about him, he had put down several riots and insurrections in Palestine in that 7-year period leading up to where we are right now. So he had a reputation of restoring the peace in a place that was just rife with insurrection. The Jews hated the Romans didn't trust the Jews, but the Romans were in charge. And they weren't going to let the Jews or anybody else upset that hierarchy that they had established down that area. So here's the man that Paul was brought to, and he read the letter, and this letter was was not entirely honest. He said, I got this man who had been beat up by the Jews and accused by them. He said, having found out he was a Roman, I rescued him. Well, he didn't find out he was a Roman citizen until he was about to stretch him out on the post to be scourged. And when he found that out, he released him immediately. And I think that point is, from that point on, he began to treat Paul differently. Because Roman citizens were not abused by their government in those days without a trial. So here we have Paul, here we have Lysias, and here we have the letter down to the governor. And the first question that the governor asked Paul, and after he read the letter and presented to Paul, said, what province are you from? I don't think Felix wanted to get in the middle of this situation if he thought he was going to get in trouble from some other ruler. So he wanted to know where Paul was from, and when he said, I'm from Cilicia, he knew that, well, I'll probably never get in trouble if I take this case. So he made a point. I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive, also giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's Praetorium. Let's go back to this movement of troops. 500 soldiers moved down, and they stopped in a place called Antipatris, and that was a little village down the way, but about 38 to 48 miles, depending on what historian you're reading, from Jerusalem. And it says the soldiers arrived there at night. Well, if it's 35 miles away, and they were soldiers, they had to have a forced march from Jerusalem to arrive there the same night. And that was a large group of men to move that fast at night to arrive there the same night. There was a possibility that they just took the time that they needed to traverse that distance on foot and on horseback, and they arrived the next night. We don't know that for sure, that's just idle speculation. It's all together, those guys were tough. Roman soldiers could move fast, and they could move, they always moved on foot unless they were on ship. They didn't have a whole lot of cavalry in those days like we do, and although they had 70 horsemen there, their strength was in the Roman army, foot soldiers, just like the Greek army before them. So, if they moved there the same night, they were moving out swiftly from 9 o'clock to get there before daylight that same night. And when they got there, they still had another 20, 25 miles to go, but they knew that they were away from the 40 conspirators and they could go back to the billets, which they did, and the 70 horsemen went on into Caesarea, take Paul. Well, Caesarea was not that big a place. This huge force coming in on horses probably caused everybody curiosity, that you have to wonder if Cornelius and his family were still there. You have to wonder if the Christians that Paul had stayed with on the way in and heard the prophecy of Agabus looked up and said, uh-oh, that prophecy came true. But the fact is, it's almost impossible for that size force to enter Caesarea without the people of Caesarea paying attention to it, since in the daytime, and it's almost certain that some of the Christians there realized that Paul was in that force. And if he was there in that force, he was in custody of the Romans, and so they could know in their own heart that a prophecy that they had heard just a few weeks before had come true. And we're looking at a prophecy. Agabus said, you're going to be in the custody of the Gentiles. And what we're looking at here in this passage is a time when Paul would spend the next half-decade in arrest, under arrest. Well, when you've been a free man, walking all over the Roman Empire, preaching the gospel and going and coming wherever you wanted to go and come, and then find yourself under arrest for the next 5 years, it begins to limit what you can do. And so Paul, but I'm sure Paul didn't waste that time. Paul was not a man to do that sort of thing, so I'm sure anybody he had the opportunity to talk to about Jesus over that 5-year period heard the story of Jesus Christ. In fact, we know that that was the case from other passages, talking about the members of the household of the emperor who were members of the church. But Paul continued to do what he did best, as best he could under those circumstances. So, that's where we find it. Are there any comments or thoughts? Yes, Mike.
Yeah, John, we started our discussion talking about the providence of God. There was nothing miraculous about this young man overhearing this discussion and reporting it. But God's hand was all in this, right? You know, today the miraculous, the supernatural is gone, but yet for the faithful Christian, God opens and closes doors. He's still involved in our lives. Good point.
That's an excellent point. The providence of God, when God is taking care of the church today, doesn't mean that he's going to remove from us all the misery and persecution that has been promised to Christians. In other words, in fact, Paul said specifically, those of us who would live godly lives are going to be persecuted, writing to Timothy about that. So we're going to have times when we are persecuted or left out of things or other maliciously treated because of the fact that we are Christians. That's not go away. But God has promised, Jesus has promised as God, that he would never leave us or forsake us. In fact, he said it in the Great Commission. Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Or your version may say, even to the end of the age. We've not yet arrived at the end of the age. That means Jesus is still with us today, taking care of the church. So no matter how tough things get, I firmly believe that we're on the edge of tough times, and I've said that a couple of times, but as I read the news, and my entire life in the past has been dealing with national security issues. So I have some background. As I look around the world today, it reminds me of the days just before World War I and the days just before World War II, when everybody was starting to arm to the teeth and wars were breaking out all over the place. And some of that language then, just as it is today, was directed at our country. So there's a very good chance that in the days ahead, some of you might live long enough to see hard times. So don't be surprised at the hard times. Just know that God is not going to forsake us, no matter how bad or how good times may be. So that's where we are with all this. Any questions on where we are? I thought the letter of Lysias to Felix was excellent. Felix had a reputation there, a man to take care of a trouble spot. He was tough, he was mean, he was cruel, and he was greedy. We'll see that a little bit more further on, but he wanted whatever he could get out of life, and he was that kind of guy. But he was treating a Roman citizen in accordance with his view of Roman law, so he was going to hear the case. And that's where we are now as we start in to the 24th chapter of the book of Acts. So I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, "Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you grant us by your kindness a brief hearing. For we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. And he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias the commander came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. By examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so." So here are the representatives of the Sanhedrin have come down to Caesarea, have gone before the governor, and have placed charges against Paul. Paul has come in, and a trial is occurring to see what Paul is guilty of. And so the representatives that came down from Jerusalem at the instruction of Lysias have arrived, and they brought along a lawyer with them. Sounds familiar to me. Lawyers, it's one of the great problems of our society today, I think, is we've got way too many lawyers. In fact, you can be sued for the drop of your hat today. Well, that wasn't quite that way in those days, but here are these guys who were leaders of the Jews, brought along an orator, argue their case before the governor. Tertullus. We don't know much about Tertullus, but that's his background. He was a lawyer. And he charged Paul with a couple of things. He said, this man is a pest. We found him to be a real pest, a fellow who stirs up dissensions among all the Jews throughout the world. Paul had a reputation. He had problems, and we know from the book of Acts even alone, that almost everywhere he went, a certain number of the Jews believed and became Christians, but a certain number of those folks turned out to be his enemies and ran him out of town at the threat of his life on a number of occasions. Whether it be Corinth, whether it be Ephesus, whether it be Thessalonica, whether it be Lystra and Antioch of Pisidia, a group of Jews invariably ran him out of those locations at the threat of his life. So it was nothing new to Paul. And so this statement that Tertullus said, that he's having a problem with Jews all over the world, says two things. He accuses him of Paul of causing the problems, but he also says it's worldwide. He caused a dissension among all the Jews in the world. Well, we know from study of the scriptures that those things did occur, but it was not Paul that was causing the problem. The riots were always led by the Jews, and not the other way around. Paul didn't go around trying to cause insurrection among the Jews, trying to get them to revolt against Rome. In fact, it was just the opposite. If he told them to do anything, it was, you obey the authorities in charge. Because they are in charge because God placed them there. We know that from the Roman letter and other letters, where we're commanded to obey the legal authorities. And what else did he say? He is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. That may be the only place in Scripture where that statement is made, talking about the sect of the Nazarenes. What did that imply? Jesus was a Nazarene. He was a son of Nazareth. He grew up in Nazareth. So they're reflecting on the fact that Jesus was from a little, perhaps decrepit village of no renown, and this massive movement, this sect, was the sect of the Nazarenes. So this was not a title of good tidings. This was said pejoratively to belittle Paul and to belittle Christians and belittle the church before the authorities of Rome. A ringleader, that means he was a top dog, if I may use that phrase. He was a top ruler, a leader of the Christian movement. And that was a charge. But from their point of view, it was not the work of God. It was a sect. Did the Jews have sects? Yeah, they did. Organizations that split off and went their own various ways. They had Pharisees, they had Sadducees, they had Essenes, they had Herodians, and in their midst they had a body of folks called Christians, who they called the sect of the Nazarenes. And he even tried to desecrate the temple. Before it was, he had desecrated the temple. He had brought a Gentile into the sacred area of the temple where no Gentile was allowed. In other words, the charge originally was he had done it. But now that charge had been waffled a little bit. And he said, he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. So, had a number of charges against Paul. Some of those charges for which he could have been executed. But they were presented in a way that didn't tell the whole story. And, by the way, the Jews from the Sanhedrin, the leaders, the religious leaders of the Jews, joined in making these false charges. And what was the law? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So they were in violation of the law of Moses right there. They knew that these charges that they were making were not true. But they had to make some charge if they wanted to get Paul executed by the Romans. That would stand up in a Roman court. So they made the charges, and the religious leaders joined in attacking, asserting that these things were so. But then, and I'm in verse 10, comments, questions? We're running out of time, but I want to read forward a little bit. When the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, knowing that for many years you have been a judge in this nation, I truly make my defense, since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself, did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. Nor can they prove to you the charges which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law, and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always blameless conscience before God and before men. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation, and to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia, who ought to have been present before you, and to make accusation, if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council, other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead I am on trial today before you. Let me read one more voice. But Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off. We've just about run out of time, and we're going to pick up again next week, the Lord willing, at that scripture. Felix, having a more excellent knowledge of the way. Here was this rough, crude governor of Judea, a powerful man with a terrible background, a former slave, having a more excellent or more thorough knowledge of the way than the Jewish leaders did. That's an amazing statement to me, but that's what the scriptures say, and I'm sure that that was in fact the case. Well, why would he have that information? Maybe Cornelius was still there after so many years.